Hello and welcome to my latest video on how to paint Katakros, Mortarch of the Necropolis by Games Workshop. In this video we're going to be looking at how to paint the cloak and the blue gem on his chest. So you can see there the paints that we're using, starting with Mephiston red. It doesn't have the best level of opacity, pretty standard for Games Workshop paints. They have like that translucent property, which is makes blending and glazing easier with them, but it does mean that you have to add multiple layers to just get that nice opaque look to them. But it is a fantastic colour. It's probably my favourite red, just because it is so dark and rich. And you can see that the cape is actually on the model at this point. Now I have got them separated. I mean, they're not glued together, so I can then break it down as you're about to see. There we go. So this allows me to get behind the model and paint some of the nice folds and things in the cloak. I would really strongly recommend that you leave the cloak off for painting it, because there is a lot of cloak that's visible but behind him. Now, usually if I'm painting something for a tabletop level, I don't really care about that kind of thing. If you can see it with a brush, you can paint it to some kind of basic level at least, so it's not a major thing if you want. But because he's like a character model, leader of your army, you probably do want to spend a bit longer on him, or indeed if you're painting for it Golden Demon. This isn't Golden Demon level, this is just more sort of like character level, tabletop-ish sort of standard, but you can just take all the same techniques I'm using and just spend a bit longer on it to refine it and everything. The first stage that I'm painting on here with the Mephiston red, these are kind of like the blocking in the highlights, so I'm using the black primer as shadow, and that's one of the really big benefits of using black primer, is that you get to use the black as shadow, and it doesn't matter too much if you miss areas in the shadows, whereas if you use a white primer, when you apply the red will look really, really vibrant, whereas at the moment you can see it looks a bit dull, and that's just because of the black showing through. So all you have to do is multiple layers, and once it gets a bit opaque, then the vibrancy is as high as it's going to get. So then it doesn't matter if it's black or white, but when you're still seeing some of the primer showing through, then having that white beneath it would definitely make it pop out more. So actually by when you're applying the red over white, you're dulling it down. But the problem is that even though you're dulling it down, you still want it to be like a very smooth finish. So if you see some of the white showing through, it's not going to look smooth, it's going to look patchy. But yeah, so as I'm applying this, I'm looking for areas that are going to catch the light. Now, it doesn't mean to say that I'm going to leave all the shadowed areas just black. And it is kind of important to check on the model, or at least pay attention to, so you can look at it under a lamp or whatever to see how the light catches it, just to see, not for the light volumes, not not the finished shape of the highlights, but just to see where the light would catch naturally, just to make your life easy to see where shadows are, basically. So you kind of painting this in, and then as you add more highlights and layers and things, you will then get to paint in the shadows as well. But I mean, you could just take it a step further and paint everything. Like if you wanted, you could just airbrush the whole cloak Mephiston red if you wanted. But I find that has a much more sterile kind of look to it. You don't get the brush marks and things. It just doesn't look as good. I mean, it looks very clean, but I find it just looks a bit boring. I mean, there's nothing wrong with using an airbrush to help you blend it or whatever, but just having flat coats of airbrush work, there's no interest in the actual brush work. But anyway, yeah, so you can see I'm just applying it kind of sloppily, really, because for a start off, I just want to get kind of like a bit of red down, and then as I'm applying it more and more, I'll be paying more attention to getting transitions down and making sure it all blends together. You should be able to see quite clearly how when you apply the red paint for a start, it looks strong, and then as it dries, it gets darker and darker and darker until it's well, if you just compare the top of this cloak at the moment, now it's obviously going to stay a little bit more red because, as I was saying, it's a second layer, so the it's increasing the opacity. But as that said, there's that little top section there that I painted. As it's slowly drying, it's getting smaller and smaller. So as it dries, it just loses that vibrancy. However, we're going to try and bring that back later on with some highlight colours. That's what the Evil Sun Scarlet's for. And also, I'm going to be using some Blood Angels Red contrast paint. But yeah, so just to talk a bit more about actually highlighting red. So I touched on it at the beginning. And when people highlight red, it goes pink or orange. And that's either because they're adding white or yellow to highlight it. Because the thing is, you know, when you highlight the colour, you want it to be lighter. But the thing is, if you want something to stay the colour that you paint it while still highlighting it, you're better off shading it and not highlighting it. Because every time you highlight the colour, you're taking the colour away. I know that doesn't, it sounds a bit strange, but you know, if you've got this red here, then I want an area to stand out more, so I add some white to it. I've just reduced the amount of red in there, and then I apply that highlight over on the model, so there's then less area of the base colour red that's visible again, and then also you're going to shade it. So again, you're reducing the amount of red on the model. By the time you finish adding highlights and shadows, there's not much left in the way of red, and so it just doesn't look red anymore. So the best way for something to look red, or indeed other colours, you know, any vibrant colour that you want to keep looking vibrant, is to just shade it and use the base colour as the highlight. And what that will actually do is it'll make it look even more red than it would if it was just all a flat red, because you then have a tonal contrast with the shadows, which makes the lighter red areas, which is actually the base colour red, stand out even more. So here you can see I'm going to start adding a little bit of shading as well with Rhinox hide. So you can see it there at the bottom of the wet palette. I know it looks quite black looking in the on the wet palette, but that's to do with a few reasons. One is the way the light is hitting it, and two, it's because it's wet. And it's quite a thick layer of paint as well, so there's, you know, things sort of adding up to, you know, kind of make it hard to see the colours in it. If I kind of spread it out a bit more on the wet palette or watered it down, you'd be able to see the brown a lot more clearly. But anyway, I'm applying this now in the undersides of shadows, or undersides of the folds in the shadows. And you might think, well, that's not going to make any difference because those were left black. Well, they weren't left black. They had some marks on. So if you look at the front of the cloak, you can see marks of red that, you know, they're a bit patchy, but they are definitely downwards facing. And it was more of a case of I covered most of the model with the Mephiston red, but then as I added extra layers, I focused those layers on the upward sections for highlighted parts, so those become more opaque, and that's, you know, the bright red parts. Well, the nice thing about Rhinox hide as well is it is kind of a reddy brown, so I mean, you probably get something actually very similar to this colour if you just added black to red. So it is kind of like a desaturated red. If you see here, I'm kind of a sort of wet blending on the model. I'm applying the paint quickly. So I applied the Rhinox hide, then I very quickly stick the paintbrush into the Mephiston red again, and just blend it on the model. So there's still paint on the paintbrush. So there's Rhinox hide on the paintbrush, and the paint on the model is still wet. So when I kind of mix it in, you know, it blends really nicely, and you get a very, very smooth transition very quickly. Now this is actually a smoother transition than you're likely to get with glazing. I mean, although, you know, if you're glazing and you do a lot of glazing, then you'll get a very smooth transition. But this is a very similar amount of smoothness, but much quicker. However, you don't have quite as much control and precision, you know, for exactly where the blends go. But with that being in shadows and things, it doesn't matter too much. And with practice, you can kind of make it work. One thing to be a little bit careful of with these, all the folds are very nearly all of them are very soft edged. So if you paint too quickly when you do the folds with a highlight edge, it's very easy to go over or round the curve a little bit. So just make sure that you keep a steady hand as you do it, because what I tend to find is if there's a hard edge, it's very easy to quickly paint an edge and then just use the side of the brush to paint the edge. On this, because the edges are so much softer, you know, it's just easy to curve around on them. Another thing you'll find is Rhinox hide does have a nice level of translucency, so you can go over some of the red that's already on there. It'll look darker as it's wet, but as it dries, some of the red will still show through. And so you can kind of go backwards and forwards a little bit to get nice transitions as well. You know, go back to the Mephiston red. And one other thing that I really want to point out. So on the cloak, that you can see the arm and those big folds that go down underneath the arm, like big U or V shapes. The highlight, the main big highlight is down the centre of those, because that's kind of like a big curve, and the light is then focused on the central part from top-down lighting, and it tends to look quite nice. And you can see from the light from my lamp as it goes down, it's actually hitting the central section. Lots of people don't do this. Normally what people do is they've seen other paintings and things, and they see how people paint. If it's an up edge, like a raised edge, it's highlighted. If it's a recess, then it's shaded. But that's not how it works. Light travels in a straight line. If that recess is directly underneath downwards facing light, it's catching light. If it's a curve at the bottom, it's actually focusing the light, so that's a highlighted area. And so the closer something is to facing the light, the brighter that section will be. You can see here I'm using the Evil Sunz Scarlet now, so I'm going over the top, just basically using it as a highlight. You can see the brush that I've used as well for all this session is, I think it's a size 1. It's an Artist Opus 1. It's an old one that I've got. You can see the tip on it. The tip is atrocious. So it's not very good for doing any neat kind of work. But what it is good for is very quick blending, because you get more surface area. You know, as you apply pressure, so you blend it very quickly. Whereas if you have a very fine tip, you have a much less surface area, so you have to do a lot more movement. Whereas this, it just quickly blends the brush, blends the paint rather. And also to be aware as well, so it does help if you every now and then put the main body of Katakros back in on top of the cloak, just to see what is hidden and what is visible, because although you want to be painting the folds and things in the cloak behind him, you don't want the back folds to be as bright and vivid as the folds at the front. You can see the section that curves around him at the front. I've put a lot more Evil Sunz Scarlet on that than in the folds further back. So here's the Blood Angels red, and there you can see as well. So I've spent a little bit more time just tweaking some of the creases and things that just to make it a bit neater. But a lot of the folds behind him are hidden, so you don't have to spend too much on that, but just make sure that they're picked out, so with upwards facing lights and things like that. So just as you rotate him round, you can see behind him. So for the Blood Angels red contrast paint, I've watered it down. It's around about 50-50 water to contrast paint. I'm sure I've ranted about this enough, but don't listen to people that say you have to water it down with medium. I mean, this is like a very thick glaze. You see, I don't want it to pool too much. I'm being a bit lazy, but because I want a fairly thick coat of it, but I don't need it to shade anything. If I wanted it to shade areas, then yes, you need to have the medium. But otherwise, you can just use water because you don't have to rely on that pooling effect. But anyway, that's the cloak done. It was very kind of quick. One thing I would say though is after you've applied the contrast paint, it's going to look quite shiny, and it's one of the big downfalls of contrast paints I find is that they do have a very shiny finish, or I say kind of satin. And I'm not so keen on that, so I do give it a coat of AKInteractive Ultra Matte Varnish. That just kills all the shininess, and also, like, if there's any kind of slight inconsistencies in the finish as well, it sort of evens it all out a bit, because different paints and mediums have different finishes, so some are shinier than others, especially if you mix your paints between, say, Vallejo and Games Workshop. You're definitely going to find some of the paints are a little bit shinier than others, and particularly in this case, the black primer is also shinier than the paintwork. So you'll find that also that the shadows will show through. But anyway, yeah. So just to quickly get onto this gem, it's very quick and easy to paint this, really. So I've started off with Sotek green. I've got. Sotek green again. It's blue. And there's Baharroth blue, and blue horror, and one other, I think, Temple Guard blue. So darkest is Sotek green that I use here. Then the next one is Temple Guard blue as the first highlight. Then Baharroth blue, then blue horror. And you kind of like just so for a start off, you just kind of cover it in Temple Guard. Sotek green, and you focus on one side, so you're doing directional lighting. But like you cover most of it as you go around, leaving just the underside a little bit darker. You can put some Sotek green on that, but just put extra layers because of, again, the translucency of the paint means that you're going to get some of the primer showing through. But don't worry about it too much because you're adding extra layers with the highlight colours. So then after you've done that, the Sotek green, you don't have to worry too much when you're applying the Sotek green about the facets of the gem. But for the next colours you do. So you start with the Temple Guard blue, and you have to pick out around about 2/3 of the facets, and you pick them all out, and make sure each facet is very clearly defined, but don't go all the way around. You have to leave some of the Temple Guard, sorry, not the Temple Guard, the Sotek green on the underside, and I've left mine slightly to the right as well, so there's a top left highlight coming in. I think it's pretty straightforward. You can see how I'm doing it, and then as you go up each tonal highlight, as it gets lighter, you just leave another facet from the previous colour. So that does mean that when you have done the Temple Guard blue, that has to be opaque. You don't want any of the previous colour showing through. And you might be like, well, why did you put the Sotek green to start with if you only need that in the shadowy kind of area? Well, for one, for some of the Sotek green, you do need at least 1 or 2 facets fully opaque Sotek green. But because then when you add the Temple Guard blue, it's not such a big tonal jump from Temple Guard blue over to the black as it is from the Sotek green to the black. So it's just easier to go over the top of it. The colour will fill in and you'll get an opaque looking finish much faster. But neatness is kind of the key here. So and the facets are quite small. I know it looks bigger in the video, but if you can, just pay attention and make sure you don't go over any of the sharp edges, because the sharp edges really do make the shape. Then, of course, you go to the Baharroth blue, you do the same thing, but you leave more of the Temple Guard blue visible. Again, just block it in till you get a fairly opaque finish. One thing you will find on this as well, if you are reasonably fast at painting, is that it doesn't dry as quick as you want it to, because it's such a small area. It's probably helpful if you paint the gem on his forehead at the same time, as long as you're going to do it the same colour. Here you can see I'm using the blue horror as the final highlight, just to pick out, I think it's either one or two facets that I've done there. So it's not white as an entirely flat facet. I'm just saving the white for the final highlight. Yeah, so I think I've just done one facet with the blue horror, and as is always the case with these things, the more blue horror that you add, the less effect it has. So you won't get the nice transition going all the way around, and it actually kind of reduces, like you're taking away the blue colour the more of the blue horror you add, because it's a very desaturated colour. So for the white, and I'm using P3 Morrow White, I'm not painting any facet entirely, a whole white. I'm just picking out a few of the edges around these colours. So edges catch light more than surfaces, flat surfaces, so it makes sense that you just pick out a few of the edges either side of the blue horror, and then obviously the little section right in the middle of the gem would also catch the light quite strongly. So here I've actually gone in with some some paint I can't remember the name of. Incubi Darkness, there we go. So Incubi Darkness is kind of similar in hue to Sotek Green. It's just desaturated really, but I've just put that in the darkest on the darkest facets, and then I'm going back over the Sotek Green just to really emphasize the solid facet shape. So that, I mean, the most important thing that you can take away from here is to really make sure each facet is clearly defined, because I'm not doing much in the way of any edge highlighting. I'm just, apart from on the highest highlight, so the having a really sharp edge from a defined facet just makes the shape stand out more. As I said, I use the Incubi Darkness just for the darkest area, so you get a little bit more contrast against the light. So there you go. You see, it's very simple painting, and that's the end of this video. For the next video, you're going to see how to paint the green gold that goes around, that holds his cloak on. But anyway, you'll see that when the video is done. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.